December 1940. A darkness, both literal and metaphorical, had settled over Europe. The battle for Britain's skies had been won at a terrible cost, but the battle for its streets, its cities, its very soul raged on. London was a constellation of fires under the nightly rain of German bombs. The industrial heartlands of Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham pounded into rubble. On a world map, the British Empire still sprawled in imperial pink, a quarter of the globe. An illusion of permanence, for in the buried, reinforced war rooms beneath Whitehall, a secret was held by a handful of men. A truth so terrifying it was locked in silence. The empire was not merely bleeding, it was hemorrhaging, and the lifeblood it was losing was not just that of its soldiers, but of its treasury. It was going bankrupt. In this subterranean fortress, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, prepared to write the most humbling dispatch of his life. His pen, which had forged words into weapons to rally a nation, now had to perform a delicate and shameful dance. The letter was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. Churchill had to inform the leader of the world's greatest neutral power that Britain, the 19th century banker to the globe, the workshop of the world, the vanquisher of Napoleon, was, for all intents and purposes, broke. The document was lengthy, detailed. It outlined the U-boat stranglehold in the Atlantic, the desperate need for destroyers for aircraft. But the true payload was in its final passages. The moment was fast approaching, Churchill wrote, when Britain would possess no more dollars to pay for the tools of survival. His people would fight on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets. But they could not fight without weapons, and they could no longer afford to buy them. It was a confession of insolvency, wrapped in a plea for deliverance. Comprehend how history's most expansive empire arrived at this precipice of destitution. We must follow the trail of gold. We must understand the ruthless economics of total war. When hostilities commenced in September 1939, Britain remained a financial colossus. Its vaults bulged with gold reserves. Its citizens and government held a vast global portfolio. Railways in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, sprawling industrial concerns within the United States itself. The city of London was the pulsating heart of world finance, insurance, and shipping. But the war Hitler waged was a new kind of conflict, a war of machines, of insatiable consumption. It devoured steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at a pace that shattered all pre-war forecasts, and Britain, an island nation, had to import nearly all of it. With Europe under blockade, Britain's lifeline stretched across the Atlantic, to the United States. America in 1940 was legally and emotionally neutral. The memory of lost sons in the trenches of France was fresh. A powerful isolationist movement held sway. Congress had erected the Neutrality Acts, designed specifically to prevent America being sucked into another foreign war. Central to these acts was the cash and carry provision. The rule was starkly simple. Nations at war could buy American materials, but they must pay for them in cash on the spot and transport them in their own ships. No credit, no loans. America would sell the instruments of war, but demanded gold on the barrelhead before a single crate left the dock. For the first year, Britain paid. It began the Great Liquidation. In a clandestine naval undertaking codenamed Operation Fish, the British government loaded its national gold wealth onto warships and fast liners, running the U-boat gauntlet to Canada. It was the largest physical transfer of wealth in human history. Billions in gold and securities were sent into exile, all to feed the American cash registers. By the time Churchill's letter reached Roosevelt's desk, the well was running dry. The gold reserves were virtually exhausted. In Washington, the British Purchasing Commission had contracts for planes and tanks sitting unsigned. The order from London was stark. There are no more dollars. Roosevelt understood the stakes. A British collapse would leave America alone against a hostile continent, but his political hands were tied. He could not simply gift billions to a foreign power. The law forbade it. Public opinion would revolt. He needed a solution that appeared to the American taxpayer as a shrewd deal, not a charitable donation. Thus was born the idea of Lend-Lease. Roosevelt presented it with a folksy parable. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of your garden hose. You lend it to him. You get it back once the flames are out. It sounded neighborly, pragmatic, generous. The reality behind the closed doors in Washington was something else entirely. This was not a conversation between friends. It was the negotiation of a forced liquidation. The American point man was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr., a fierce anti-fascist who wanted Britain to win, but a fiercer guardian of the American purse. His position was brutal in its logic. Before the United States offered a single dime of aid, Britain must prove it had sold every last saleable asset it owned. He demanded a full audit of the entire British Empire, every government holding, every private investment across the globe. He wanted to see the value of every shell, every share, every overseas factory. The British delegation, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, was aghast. They were not being treated as an ally, but as a bankrupt corporation in receivership. Phillips argued that a fire sale of long-term investments would yield pennies on the dollar, crippling Britain's post-war recovery. Morgenthau was unmoved. The instruction was clear: scrape the barrel. British lords still owned profitable assets in America. Why should the Iowa farmer pay for their tanks? The most poignant symbol of this coercive stripping was the case of the American Viscose Corporation. This industrial giant, the crown jewel of British chemical investment in America, was a cash cow, generating millions in dividends that helped balance Britain's trade books. Morgenthau zeroed in on it. Sell it, he demanded. Deposit the cash in the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing orders. The British resisted. The company was worth over $100 million. A forced sale was financial sabotage. But Morgenthau held the ultimate leverage: the Lend-Lease Bill, fragile and facing isolationist opposition in Congress. He needed a sacrifice to prove British desperation. His ultimatum was cold: sell Viscose or watch Lend-Lease die. On March 15, 1941, under duress, the British government used emergency powers to seize and sell American Viscose. The American bankers, knowing the seller's back was against the wall, drove a merciless bargain. It fetched roughly $54 million, half its true value. The dollars went to the U.S. Treasury. The British government was left to compensate the original owners in devalued sterling, adding to its own mountainous debt. The Viscose sale was a psychic turning point. The British ruling class understood with cold clarity the nature of the special relationship. They were not equal partners. They were a bankrupt client, having their assets stripped to pay for their survival. And it wasn't just corporate wealth. The liquidation extended to the very geopolitical foundations of empire. Simultaneously, another deal was struck. Churchill, desperate to protect the Atlantic lifeline from U-boats, had begged for 50 old, mothballed American destroyers from World War I. Roosevelt agreed. But again, there was a price, and it was territorial. In exchange for these 50 rusting hulls, the United States demanded, and received, 99-year leases to establish military bases on a string of British territories, from Newfoundland and Bermuda down through the Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, and British Guiana. Overnight, America acquired a strategic network encompassing the entire Western Atlantic and the Caribbean. Britain, the former naval superpower, had hawked its strategic family silver for a handful of obsolete ships. By the time the Lend-Lease Act passed in March 1941, Britain was financially naked. Its gold was gone, its prime U.S. assets were being sold, its bases were leased. The aid that now began to flow, the tanks, planes, food, was a lifeline. Without it, Britain would have been starved into submission. It was publicly the arsenal of democracy. But the fine print contained a clause that would prove lethal to the imperial system. Article WWII. In dense diplomatic language, it committed Britain to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. This was the economic mortar of the empire, a system of tariffs that bound the colonies and dominions to trade preferentially with Britain. It was a protective wall that allowed British goods to compete. By signing Article WWII, Britain agreed to dismantle its own economic fortress. It was signing a warrant for the dissolution of its trading bloc. They signed because they had no choice. The bombers were overhead, the U-boats were sinking ships, the treasury was empty. The dynamic shifted again after Pearl Harbor. America was now a formal ally. Its economy, supercharged by war spending, exploded in size and efficiency. But Britain's economy was entirely cannibalized for war production. It stopped exporting civilian goods. It abandoned its traditional markets in South America, Asia, and the Dominions. And who filled that vacuum? American industry. While British factories made only Spitfires and shells, American factories made those and cars, refrigerators, and radios for a world hungry for goods. America was fighting the war and capturing Britain's commercial future. By 1944, the transfer was profound. The financial capital of the world had migrated from London to New York. The world's gold had settled in Fort Knox. Yet, a final, devastating reckoning awaited. The British clung to a belief that their singular sacrifice, standing alone from 1940 to 1941, would be honored with post-war generosity. They assumed Lend-Lease would continue during a transition to peace, allowing them to reconvert their industry and feed their people. They were wrong. They had forgotten the lesson of the Viscose sale. In the calculus of power, gratitude holds no value. On August 15, 1945, victory over Japan was announced. In London, euphoria erupted. The long nightmare was over. In Washington, 7 days later, President Harry Truman signed an order. Lend-Lease was terminated. Immediately, absolutely, ships laden with food and supplies bound for Britain were ordered to turn around mid-Atlantic. The lifeline was severed with surgical coldness. The shock in London was paralyzing. The economy, entirely geared for war, was instantly bankrupt. It imported half its food and nearly all its raw materials. Without lend-lease dollars, it could pay for none of it. The architect of the welfare state, economist John Maynard Keynes, saw a financial Dunkirk looming, a collapse into starvation and anarchy. Britain had no option but to return to Washington, cap in hand. In September 1945, a frail and dying Keynes sailed to America. He came not as a celebrated genius, but as a supplicant. He made a moral argument. Britain had spent its wealth as the front line. America should now provide a $6 billion grant, a retroactive payment for saving civilization. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, were implacable. The war was over. Sympathy had expired. There would be no gift, only a loan, and not a generous one. After months of grueling talks, the terms were set. A loan of $3.75 billion with interest. And it came with a condition more destructive than the interest rate: sterling convertibility. Within 1 year, Britain must make the pound freely exchangeable for dollars. Keynes knew this was a trap. The sterling area, a network of countries forced to hold pounds and trade with Britain, was the last remnant of imperial economic power. Once convertible, everyone would rush to dump devalued pounds for coveted dollars to buy superior American goods. It would trigger a run on the pound that would vaporize the loan. But the alternative was unthinkable. Britain, defeated at the negotiating table, accepted the terms. Keynes returned home broken. He would be dead within months. The predicted catastrophe arrived on schedule. On July 15, 1947, Britain made the pound convertible. The global stampede to sell sterling began instantly. The loan money hemorrhaged at a catastrophic rate. Within just 5 weeks, facing reserves annihilation, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility. The humiliation was absolute. They had failed under American rules. This financial emasculation had immediate geopolitical consequences. In February 1947, London sent a secret telegram to Washington. For centuries, Britain had been the power containing Russia in the Mediterranean, propping up Greece and Turkey. The telegram's message was simple: we are broke. We are withdrawing. The burden is now yours. This communique directly triggered the Truman Doctrine. America formally assumed the mantle of global policeman. The baton of hegemony had passed. The austerity deepened. In 1949, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 30%, a stark admission of diminished standing. But the final reckoning for victory was a mortgage that stretched across generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not forgiven. With interest, it was paid back year after year, decade after decade. Through the Cold War, through economic crises and booms, the British Treasury sent its checks to Washington. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 61 years after the guns fell silent. So what is the price of victory? This story dismantles the myth that wars have clear winners. In the modern era, total war can be a negative-sum game. Nazi Germany was militarily crushed and morally destroyed. But Britain, which emerged victorious, was financially gutted. The only unambiguous victor was the United States. Its homeland untouched, its economy doubled, it held 2/3 of the world's gold. Through Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, it didn't conquer the British Empire. It purchased its assets, acquired its bases, and dismantled its trade barriers in history's most consequential distressed asset sale. For Britain, the legacy was a permanent sense of decline, a national psyche scarred by the realization that its finest hour was also the beginning of its liquidation. The special relationship was, and remains, a partnership of profound asymmetry, forged not just in shared blood but in transferred gold. When Winston Churchill penned that desperate letter in December 1940, he secured his nation's survival. But in doing so, he inadvertently signed the instrument of sale. He traded an empire for the time and tools to fight on. It was a necessary bargain. There was no other path, but the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war a moral titan but an economic dependent. It spent its centuries-old inheritance to purchase freedom for the West. It was a noble, perhaps unparalleled, sacrifice. Yet in the cold, unforgiving ledgers of history, it was recorded not as a triumph, but as a liquidation. The empire did not simply fade away. It was sold, piece by precious piece, to pay the ultimate bill for doing what was right. This is that day. To delve deeper into the hidden forces that shape our world, subscribe and explore our library. Because true understanding lies not just in the battles fought, but in the prices paid.